Basics, a quadratic equation is an equation equivalent to an equation, so there's an equal sign involved, of the type ax to the power of 2 plus bx plus c is equal to 0. So the power of the x variable is 2, the highest power of the x variable is 2. So where a is a non-zero, so you have to have an x squared term in order for it to be called a quadratic. We can solve a quadratic equation by factorizing and using the null factor law. And the null factor law states that if AB, so if AB is equal to 0, then either A is equal to 0 or B is equal to 0, or both A and B are equal to 0. Because if two things multiply together to give you 0, one of them has to be 0 or both of them have to be 0. Okay? So if you want to just make a note on that stuff. Okay, so our first example is, I'm going to solve 4t plus 1 on 3t minus 5 is equal to 0. Now, if I was to multiply this out, expand the brackets using FOIL, then I would end up with a quadratic equation. So just really quickly, I'm going to do that using FOIL. 4t times 3t gives me 12t squared. And 1 times 3t gives me plus 3t. And 4t times negative 5 gives me negative 20t. And 1 times negative 5 gives me negative 5. Okay, so straight away, if I was to collect my like terms, which are my 3t and my negative 20t, I end up with negative 17t. So I get 12t squared negative 17t minus 5 is equal to 0. Okay, so I can see that straight away that that's a quadratic equation. So one of our rules for using a quadratic equation is to solve a quadratic equation is to use the null factor law, which is AB is equal to 0, then one of them or both of them, the factors have to be equal to 0. Okay, so just directly underneath that, notice the equation is given in the form AB equals 0, so two things multiplied together give you 0, which is what this equation here is telling us. So I'm going to set each factor equal to 0, because if two things close together, or two things times together give you 0, then one of them has to be 0 or both of them have to be 0. So I'm going to let each factor 4t plus 1, and then also 3t minus 5 equal to 0. So first up, 4t, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit, guys, so I get better work with the pen. 4t plus 1 is equal to 0, or over here I'm going to do 3t minus 5 is equal to 0. So if 4t plus 1 is equal to 0, when I bring over my negative 1, or my plus 1, it becomes a negative 1. So 4t is equal to negative 1, and two things close together means times, so 4 times t is equal to negative 1. When I bring the times across, it becomes divide, so t is equal to negative 1 divided by 4. And if I solve my other solution, my t over here, I get 3t is equal to, when I bring my negative 5 over, it becomes plus 5. And then two things close together means times, so when I bring the 3 over, it becomes divide, so it's 5 divided by 3. So my two solutions for that equation are t is equal to 1/4 and t is equal to 5/3. So that means I've got two real solutions. Okay, that one and that one. So I would like to check if I can put these back in for t, and then it should equal to 0. Okay, next example. So the next example, it's not in factor form, so that last example was already in factor form, it had already been factorized. So the next example isn't in factor form, so I'm going to write it in factor form so that I can use my null factor theorem, which says that if two factors times together to give you 0, one of them has to be 0. So quadratic equation, I'm going to factorize the left hand side, so the x squared plus 7x is going to be opened up into two brackets, and it's going to equal to 0. So x squared gives me my two x's, and the factors of 6 are 1 and 6, or 2 and 3. So which of them is going to give me my 7 in the middle? It's going to be 6 and 1. My last sign is a positive, so they're going to be the same, and I want them to both be positives because my first sign is positive. So plus 6 and plus 1. Okay, so straight away I've got my factor form now for my equation, and I can use the null factor law. So let each one equal to 0, so x plus 6 is equal to 0, or x plus 1 is equal to 0. Again, my factor law states, my null factor law states that if two things time together to give you 0, one of them has to be 0, so I'm going to check which one is 0. So x is equal to negative 6, or x is equal to negative 1. So there are my two real solutions again, negative 6 and negative 1. Okay, next example. So x squared plus 10x is equal to negative 25. Again, I've got an x squared term, so I'm talking about having a quadratic. It's not exactly in factor form at the minute. So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and write it in this form, and then I'll be able to open up my two brackets to factor them. Okay, so I bring my negative 25 over, and it becomes plus 25. And then that's equal to 0. Again, I have to have it equal to 0 or I can't use my null factor law. So I'm going to put it in factor form, factorize the quadratic equation. So x squared gives me x and x. 25, I've got 1 and 25, and I've got 5 times 5. So which of them are going to give me 10? It's going to be the 5 and the 5. So again, plug in my 5 and my 5. The last sign is positive, so they're both going to be the same, and the first sign is positive, so they're both going to be positives. So then I can let them equal to 0, so the null factor law again, two things close together means times, and two things times together to give you 0 means one of them has to be 0. So I've just left myself some more room underneath, sorry. So I'm going to take both of them, so x plus 5 is equal to 0. So then x is equal to negative 5. Oops. And the same for the other factor, x plus 5 is equal to 0. So x is equal to negative 5. Again, so that's just one real solution this time because they happen to be the same. So one real repeated solution. Okay. So my next example, 12y squared minus 5y is equal to 2. Again, it's not in factor form and it's not in standard form, so I need to write it like this so that I can then factorize the left hand side. So my 12y squared minus my 5y, when I bring my positive 2 over, it becomes take 2, is equal to 0. I need it to equal to 0. If it's not equal to 0, I can't write the null factor law. It has to equal to 0, so please make sure that it equals to 0. Open up my two brackets, equals 0. Now, 12y, I've got a coefficient for my y, so I'm going to also have to look at the factors of that. So 1 and 12, 2 and 6, and 3 and 4. My factors of 2 are a little bit easier, so it's 1 and 2, so I have no choice. I have to use 1 and 2. And now I'm going to study my coefficient of y to work out my factors with the 1 and the 2 to see which is going to give me the 5. So 1 and 12 and 2, so 2 times 12 is 24, and 1 can only give me 25 or 23. That won't work. 2 times 1 would give me 2 and 12, which would be 12 take 2 is 10, or 12 plus 2 is 14. That's not going to work. 2 and 6 doesn't work either, but 3 and 4 will. So I'm going to say 4, sorry, I need to put on my pencil. So 4y in the first bracket and 3y in the second bracket. Because what I'm going to do is the 4y times the 2, which is going to give me 8y, and the 1 times the 3y, which will give me 3y, and 8y and 3y together will end up giving me my 5y in the center. Okay, so my last sign is a negative, so I want them to be different, and my first sign is negative, so I want the bigger one to be negative. Remember, we said 4y times 2 was going to give us the 8y, so that's the bigger one, so I need the 2 to be negative and the 1 to be positive. And now I can use the null factor law because I have two things in factor form and they're both equal to 0 when they're multiplied together. So pick up my pen, 4y plus 1 is equal to 0, then 4y is equal to negative 1, then y is equal to negative 1/4. water. Or 3y minus 2 is equal to 0, so 3y is equal to 2, so y is equal to 2 over 3. Okay, so I've got two real solutions. With that solution. Okay, next. Now, 5x squared is equal to 6x. So again, I'm trying to write it in standard form, but I notice that I don't have a constant term, so I don't have a c. But I'm going to write it in this form anyway, bringing my 6x over to my 5x squared. So I will have 5x squared minus 6x is equal to 0. Again, the whole idea is that it's equal to 0. If it's not equal to 0, I can't apply this formula down here, which is telling me the null factor law. So now I'm going to factor the left-hand side. So it's not a trinomial this time, there's no 3 terms, so it's 2 terms. So factor the left-hand side, I'm going to take out the highest common factor. So to take out the highest common factor, it's x. So x on 5x minus 6 is equal to 0. X out of 5x squared gives me 5x, and x from 6x gives me 6. Again, I can apply my null factor law. Two things multiply together to give you 0, so these two things multiply together. This x times everything inside the bracket gives me 0. So now I have to let each factor equal to 0. So x is going to be equal to 0, or 5x minus 6 is equal to 0. 5x is then equal to plus 6 when you bring it over, and then x is equal to 6 divided by 5. Again, got two real solutions. Okay, easy. Now, gets a little bit trickier here when you're solving by taking a square root, and I'll explain what that means. So an alternate method of solving a quadratic equation is using the principle of taking the square root of each side of an equation. So if you've got your x squared is equal to something, then you can square root both sides, and that will give you an x value. Okay, and remember that if you square root something, you have to take a positive and negative answer. So if I was to say x squared is equal to 9, then x is equal to the square root of 9, then x is equal to plus or minus 3, because negative 3 times negative 3 is 9, and positive 3 times positive 3 is 9, so you have to take both solutions into account. Okay. So this first one here, I'm going to let my x squared be equal to the other. So divide the equation by the HCF, I'll do that in a second. 3x squared minus is equal to positive 36 when you bring the minus 36 over. And then I'm going to take out my 3, so I'm going to divide both by 3. So I get x squared is equal to 12. Okay, and now I can take the square root of both sides. So x squared is equal to 12. So x is going to be equal to plus or minus the square root of 12. Okay, so I've got two solutions for my x. Again, I've got two real solutions. Okay, next one. Solve by taking square roots of the following. So the part that's being squared is inside the bracket here. So I'm going to isolate that part there. So I need to get rid of this 4 is the problem. So I need to bring it over. When I bring the 4 over, it becomes divide. So my new equation is z minus 3, all to be squared, is equal to 100 divided by 4, which is 25. Okay. And now I can take the square root of both sides. So if I square root z minus 3 squared, it gives me z minus 3 is equal to the plus or minus of 25. And again, I'm trying to work out solutions for z, so I want my answer to look like z is equal to something. That's what I want my answer to look like. That's my final product. Okay, so I'm going to isolate the z on the left-hand side. So I end up with z is equal to plus or minus the square root of 25 plus 3.